These are certainly uncertain times for a lot of the people all over the world, and particularly for Americans and especially for Asian Americans. There's been a significant spike in the number of anti-Asian violence cases within the last several years. And I would like to address some of the key questions pertaining to why there has been such a preponderance of violence against Asian Americans, and also how we may be able to understand it, perhaps analytically, and what is the importance also of knowing about anti-Asian violence. In 2021, President Biden signed into law COVID-19 Hate Crimes Act in response to a number of reports that demonstrated really a significant increase in anti-Asian violence. There have been government reports as well as coalitional organization reports all demonstrate a significant spike. In one of the reports, Stop AAPI Hate Coalition documented a total of some 10,000 plus hate crimes and incidents from March of 2020 to December of 2021. And this is incredible, over 10,000 cases dealing with hate crimes and hate incidents. And to help us understand and to frame the issue more analytically regarding anti-Asian violence, I would like to introduce a renowned sociologist by the name of Herbert Blumer, who spoke about race prejudice as a sense of group position. So race prejudice as a sense of group position. He posited that the group position approach involves more than just simply negative stereotypes and negative feelings, but it premises on the basic idea that race prejudice is fundamentally a matter of relationship between racial groups that develop racial identifications of oneself and of others. This collective process develops into a sense of group position in a hierarchy where the dominant racial group possesses four basic types of feelings. And these include a feeling of superiority, a feeling that the subordinate race is intrinsically different or alien, a feeling of proprietary claim to certain areas of privilege and advantage, and finally, a fear and suspicion that the subordinate race harbors designs on the prerogatives of the dominant race. As a contemporary to Herbert Blumer, Gordon Allport in 1954 devised what is known as a scale of prejudice and discrimination in his book, The Nature of Prejudice, which is a classic book on discrimination. His central concern was to understand the mechanisms that contributed to the horrific human deeds, such as the massive genocide of the Jewish and other populations during World War II. Well before enacting extreme violence, Allport noted in his studies the presence of telltale signs prior to massive genocide. His scale consists of 5 elements that support and complement Herbert Blumer's notion of group position. And these include anti-locution, avoidance, discrimination, physical attack, and extermination. Anti-locution literally means negative speech or negative sayings based on stereotypical images that draw connections between an individual and the group to which one belongs. So what happens after a group has been identified and socially stigmatized by other groups. A general tendency is for other groups to avoid contact experience with such a stigmatized group, which creates, in sociological sort of terms, social distance between the populations. And over time, when such a social distance is sustained, then it becomes easier for different sort of groups to be able to dehumanize each other and to allow for structural discrimination to take root. So those are some of the necessary conditions prior to any particular sort of dominant group exerting their dominance through physical attacks and other kinds of rejective sort of behaviors. Now, what are the key dimensions of Bloomers group position theory that may help us understand Asian American identity and experience? First, the sense of group position moderates the relations between the dominant and the subordinate groups, and this involves emotional and rational investments that through development of perceptions, judgments, sensitivities, and proclivities. And group position is not merely a reflection of the objective sort of condition or relations between groups, but it is an ongoing process of shaping where one group in relation to other ought to be. So it is an aspirational process, it is dynamic, and it is historical, right? Race prejudice is also a defensive mechanism or reaction to many forms of challenges to the sense of group position. These are challenges to the dominant group's sense of superiority, exclusiveness, proprietary claim, power and privilege, and economic advantage. It is an effort to preserve the integrity and the position of the dominant group. Finally, group position is formed through what is known as a running process of history. So it's not something that happens in a certain moment in history, but it is a fluid process that develops over time through a historical periods in which the dominant group defines and redefines the subordinate group and the relations between them. Asian Americans have suffered many of the same treatments of racial subordination as other racial minorities. Historically, Asian Americans were relegated to a position where they became generally invisible, except in times when they were being blamed for a crisis. Asian Americans assume the center stage not as the dominant subjects, but as objects of some other group's agenda. Their hyper-visibility is cause for concern because it means someone else is controlling the narrative. So I would like to highlight some key moments in history where Asian Americans were thrust into the limelight and into the spotlight. Right? There are four main periods that I could discuss that reflect major developments of abstract images of Asian Americans, and there's a significant overlap between periods, so the periodization can be somewhat flexibly divided. Generally speaking, so these are the four major periods to which I'm going to address. So generally speaking, Asian Americans entered the American scene during the gold rush, but the idea of race had been already formed. In the pre-19th century, various naturalists and pseudoscientists have sought to explain the presumed physiological differences and to make sense of their life world. The idea of race developed in a hierarchy seemingly paying attention to nuanced differences across racial types. However, these meticulous methods of measuring difference and ascribing meaning to those differences would yield to a much more rigid classification of race in social policies, right? So on key issues of social life, the idea of race served to divide between white and all other non-white races. Legally, Asians seldom occupy the white status or the honorary white or in between black and white because there was no such a thing in determining the rights and privileges for Asian Americans. Within 5 years of their arrival in San Francisco, the Chinese gold miners would be embroiled in a murder case where they increasingly became the target of unfair taxation and violence. The California Supreme Court case of People versus Hall in 1854 involved a murder of a Chinese miner named Lin Sing, who was killed by the tax collector George Hall. The outcome of this decision that prohibited the Chinese race from testifying in court against their white assailants had profound effects. Right? If they were prevented by law from testifying against their white assailants, then it was tantamount to an invitation to legalize violence and structural discrimination. The social position of the Chinese immigrants would fall dramatically to the level of blacks, mulattoes, and Indians who were already prohibited by law from testifying against white persons. Like the blacks in the South, the Chinese communities were segregated in the worst parts of the city, forbade from engaging in economic activities, and subjected to vigilante and coordinated violence. Consistent with state laws prohibiting economic and political activities of the Chinese, numerous communities also bore witness to systemic violence during the decade leading up to the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 and beyond. Between 1870s and 1880s alone, a total of 153 anti-Asian riots, not individual cases, but entire communities were essentially attacked and driven out of their towns. So these were mob violence and riots had occurred across the American West, culminating in the killing of some 34 Chinese miners by a gang of 7 horse thieves in Hell's Canyon, Oregon, where the site has been renamed the Chinese Massacre Cove. As the intensity of anti-Chinese sentiment reached new heights, the US Congress deliberated the possibility of excluding Chinese from immigration. Already in 1875, the Page Law was passed on the perception that the Chinese women came to the United States mostly engaging in prostitution. This time, though, the Congress sought to close off labor immigration from China by passing the only ethnicity-based immigration exclusion law in U.S. history, known as the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. The Chinese question would be raised again in an historic U.S. Supreme Court case in the Plessy versus Ferguson, which established the separate but equal doctrine that initiated a racial segregation system in the entire United States of America, in which Justice John Harlan, who is known for Justice John Harlan, who is known for his famous dissenting opinion, says something very interesting about the Chinese in his argument against racial segregation of African Americans, right? So this is a part of the US Supreme Court opinion, and Justice Harlan was the only person in the US Supreme Court who dissented against racial segregation. And if you study law in the US, this is one of the classic cases that almost every law school student studies. And he made really sort of emphatic speech regarding why it would be immoral and also unconstitutional for the United States to segregate against the African Americans by using Chinese as an example. So he said, there is a race so different from our own that we do not permit those belonging to it to become citizens of the United States. And in fact, the Chinese race could not become naturalized citizens of the United States until 1965. Persons belonging to it are, with few exceptions, absolutely excluded from our country, and he's here referring to the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. I allude to the Chinese race. But by the statute in question, a Chinaman can ride in the same passenger coach with white citizens of the United States, while citizens of the black race in Louisiana are yet declared to be criminals, liable to imprisonment, if they ride in a public coach occupied by citizens of the white race. It is scarcely just to say that a colored citizen should not object to occupying a public coach assigned to his own race. Now, from Harlan's vantage point, the Chinese race was not deserving of a better treatment than African Americans, right? If Chinese Americans are not segregated, then surely it does not make legal or moral sense for the United States to segregate against African Americans. Justice Harlan's pleading dissent notwithstanding, the court's 7-1 decision would leave a damaging legacy on Asian Americans, particularly in education. In the 1927 US Supreme Court case, known as the Gonglum v. Rice, two Chinese American parents had sued a local district in Mississippi for denying their children from attending the neighborhood school due to the racial segregation order. Chief Justice William Taft, who had been the President of the United States, now the Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court, delivered the unanimous opinion of the court, stating that no right of a Chinese citizen of the United States under the federal Constitution is infringed by classifying the Chinese for purposes of education with colored children and denying them the right to attend schools established for the white race. The underlying rationale of the decision was deeply held fear of racial integration beyond that of the blacks and whites. And this perceived fear was bluntly captured in a Mississippi Supreme Court case a few years earlier. Gonglum's lawyers, in fact, ironically used the fear of racial mixing as an argument for the Chinese race. So arguing for Gonglum, who was a Chinese American who was being subjected to racial integration, Gonglum's lawyer was making the following argument as a defense against racial segregation, right? So he writes, it's quite interesting, the white and the Caucasian race, which makes the laws and construes and enforces them, thinks that in order to protect itself against the infusion of the blood of other races, its children must be kept in schools from which other races are excluded. If there is a danger in association, it is a danger from which one race is entitled to protection just the same as another, right? So what he's saying here is that the white race passed all these laws in order to protect itself from the danger of African Americans. And so he's arguing that to not provide the same level of protection for the Chinese would be discriminatory, right? So the Chinese race deserved to be protected from the danger of intermixing with African Americans. The court, in the end, did not buy this argument and viewed the Chinese on the same level as, did not view the Chinese on the same level as the white race. Now, emboldened by the US Supreme Court's decisions affirming racial segregation and thereby relegating Asian Americans to the status equal to the colored races, the US Supreme Court extended repeatedly the marginalization of Asians in cases involving naturalization, while Congress enacted exclusions against diverse Asian immigrant populations. And I'll talk about just one case here, and it involves a Korean American who served in the US military, and he wanted to become a naturalized US citizen. His name is Isak Emson Char. Some of you may be familiar with him. And he basically argued that he deserves to become a naturalized citizen on the basis of his character, on the basis of his cultural assimilation into American society. But the court in 1921 stated that all of those things are immaterial, not very important. What is important is what the statute, what the law at the time said. And the law that the court's justice referred to was the 1790 naturalization law, which stipulated that only free white persons could become naturalized US citizens. And so in 1921, a Korean American, while applying for naturalized US citizenship because of the 1790 law, he was denied citizenship through naturalization, despite the fact that he had served in the US military. And in fact, all other races and ethnic populations that have immigrated into the United States between 1790 and 1965 had to pass the race test. They had to, if they wanted to become naturalized US citizens. So they all sort of banged on the door of the US Supreme Court, claiming that they all deserved to become naturalized US citizens. And it wasn't not until 1965 that the US Supreme Court, and through the passage of another law, that these previously excluded populations would be able to become, for the first time, naturalized US citizens. Now, I'm going to move on to the crisis years between the 1930s and 1950s. The race politics during the period between the 1930s and the 1950s sustained, among numerous other disadvantages and social stigma, the characterization of Asians as not only the second-class aliens ineligible for naturalization, but also a fungible race that can be molded and shaped to fill ideological gaps in diverse venues of American life. Historically, Asians represented the silent and submissive outsider who can flexibly meet labor needs, while their perpetual foreigner status can bring about a range of social responses in times of national crisis, such as the Great Depression, world wars, and communism of the Cold War era. And there are three interesting sort of cases that I think demonstrate the manner in which Asian Americans were relegated to the margins during these moments of crisis. During, for instance, the Great Depression in the 1930s, Filipino Americans, for instance, who were colonial subjects of the United States upon the conclusion of the Spanish-American War in 1898, were allowed to enter the United States more or less freely. but the United States government decided to prohibit Filipino Americans from immigrating into the United States any further by providing them a guarantee of independence so that the Filipinos coming from the Philippines to the United States would be treated under the existing immigration exclusion laws, right? And also in 1935, the US would pass what is known as the Repatriation Act, which was basically an act to return Filipinos who were resident in the United States back to the Philippines by providing one-way passage sort of ticket back to the Philippines on the promise that they would not be able to re-enter the United States. During World War II, of course, many of us may be familiar with the internment experience of Japanese Americans. And there were a lot of sort of conflicting reports as to why it was necessary or not necessary to intern almost 120,000 Japanese Americans. And I wanted to share with you some of those sort of racial sort of thinking or logic that supported the eventual incarceration of Japanese Americans. So I'll just share with you the quote that I have it on my slide, right? And this is a quote from the General DeWitt, who was overseeing the internment of Japanese Americans. And he argued that, and I quote, "In the war in which we are now engaged, racial affinities are not severed by migration," right? The Japanese race is an enemy race, and while many second and third generation Japanese born on the United States soil, possessed of United States citizenship, have become Americanized, the racial strains are undiluted. It therefore follows that along the vital Pacific coast, over 112,000 potential enemies of Japanese extraction are at large today. So what he's basically saying here is that it doesn't really matter how many generations have elapsed. As long as your parents or your heritage is Japanese, third generation, fourth generation Japanese Americans will grow up not as Americans, but as Japanese, thus classifying American-born Japanese Americans as the enemy race, right? The Los Angeles Times at that time also suggested evacuation of Japanese Americans utilizing a very similar racialist sort of language. And it stated, I quote, a viper is a snake. A viper is nonetheless a viper wherever the egg is hatched. So a Japanese American born of Japanese parents grows up to be a Japanese, not an American, right? So making comparisons to a viper, a snake, Japanese Americans during this time period were fundamentally sort of dehumanized in order to treat them as though they had done something fundamentally wrong, right? Japanese, being of Japanese descent. And we could have just as easily applied this to any other ethnic populations, right? The change in political winds in the latter part of the 1940s and into the 1950s during the Cold War also brought about significant changes in the perception of the various Asian Americans. During World War II, for instance, the Chinese Americans served in the US military in segregated military units, right? And during World War II, China was an ally of the United States. So in response to their allyship, the United States government decided to grant naturalized citizenship to Chinese immigrants for the first time, right? But shortly thereafter, in 1949, China becomes red with the rise of Mao Zedong and the Communist Party in China. This would have a detrimental impact on the Chinese Americans who may have had any kind of relationship with their families back in China. And so during the 1950s, Senator McCarthy, who had initiated really sort of, extensive investigations to root out communism in the United States, targeted Chinese Americans and forced them to sort of confess that they had no measurable ties with communism in China. And there are a lot more examples that I cannot go into. So the transformation years between 1965 and to the present context. And this period is almost 60 years, and I could divide this up into other periods, but for the sake of time, I'm going to try to just sum up just a few of the key points. The civil rights movement era of the 1950s and 1960s brought about a major change in race-based policies. There were significant improvements, beginning with the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, and the Immigration and Naturalization Act of 1965. All of these were products of the civil rights movement that significantly impacted not only African Americans who were on the forefront of the civil rights movement, but it would also have profound impact on Asian Americans as well. And so these changes also complicated the perception of Asian Americans, on the one hand, as an exceptional minority, because there has been a significant sort of influx of middle-class, more well-educated Asians who have immigrated into the United States. That population differs significantly from the previous generations where they were mostly sort of common laborers. And so the perception was that their work ethic and their proper cultural values contributed to their success in America, thus gaining the label model minority. While the increasing global competition over labor and goods prompted imports from Asia and displaced American workers, revived the age-old image of Asian workers as unfair competitors who undermined American labor on the other. So there were two diametrically opposed images of Asian Americans in the post-1965 period. Now, these contradictory images can flexibly and selectively reify or show up in certain contexts and have laid the foundation for other abstractions. The line separating between Asia and Asian Americans became blurred repeatedly, right? Thus, reinscribing the perception of perpetual foreigner image, especially in times of national crisis, such as the COVID-19 pandemic, right? As Bloomer and Alpert noted, the sense of group position among various races in the United States is shaped by stereotypical representations, segregation of neighborhoods and schools, inequality of opportunities in jobs and wealth creation, and the lack of intentional efforts to bridge these gaps. And the groups that are in positions of dominance continue to protect their privileged racial status, while the minority groups compete for recognition, resources, and representation. I'm going to end here for the sake of time because I think I've already said a lot of things, and I will reserve the final slide for perhaps a conversation at the end where we could talk about how this notion of group position regarding Asian American experience may be applicable in the Korean context. Thank you so much for listening.